now with a literary agent. Kevin serves on the editorial boards of the Mark Twain Journal and Firsts Magazine, and holds an MLS from the University of Texas. So now, without further ado, I'll turn this over to Kevin.
I'm going to move along pretty quickly this evening. You probably are wondering what a Twain't is, despite the advertising and the announcements. A Twain't is a derivative work that draws upon Twain's works. It's usually printed. I don't include TV, radio, impersonators, movies. Usually a printed item, but I even include items that are embossed or raised lettering if it's engraved in stone or a ceramic object. They can be a book, they can be advertising, they can be a poster, and they somehow use Twain's works as a point of departure or an inspiration. They might use Twain as a character in a novel. They might use a plot or a theme. They might be a parody. They might be a pastiche. They could be any kind of writing that derives or is inspired by Twain's works. They could be aphorisms. They could be fake Twain items, or they could be real Twain, genuine Twain writings presented in a new format, like a graphic novel or a comic book. But they are cultural artifacts. They're evidence. They reflect the culture of the time in which they're created, so they're significant in a scholarly way, even though they're a lot of fun. I've identified more than 550 of the damn things. We're going to go through all of them tonight. Okay, you know I'm kidding. We're not going to go through all of those tonight. We're going to try to go through about 50 of them in 40 minutes. If I get this done in less than 50 minutes, I will be surprised. And I'm going to, with that, jump right into the very first Twain't. The earliest Twain't that I can identify with any certainty is in 1870, a novel by John Swift, who didn't know Twain personally, but spent time in Nevada, and his legal career was squashed in Nevada, and he got very angry, and he wrote this novel, Robert Greathouse, for revenge, and he included all of the people that he knew in Nevada that he had a grudge against. And one of them was Mark Twain. So Mark Twain is one of the characters in this novel. He's portrayed as a drunkard and a newspaper reporter, kind of lazy. And there's a whole story behind it that I wrote up in the Mark Twain Journal, which I think is kind of interesting, even if everyone else doesn't. But I think that this guy, when he wrote a travelogue, that travelogue inspired Twain to write Innocents Abroad. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, not direct evidence, but very strong circumstantial evidence that Twain got the idea of traveling, writing letters to a California newspaper, which was a competitor with the newspaper that published this guy's letters, and went from there. And I think that when Twain's book took off as a bestseller and this particular book flopped, that he was jealous and he included Twain to get revenge against him along with everybody else. But it didn't go so well, because in 1878, Mr. Swift untwainted his book. It was no longer really a Twain't, because he took Twain and some of the other victims of his parody out of his novel. So it was no longer a Twain't. So the first edition is a Twain't, and the second edition of 1878 is not. This particular Twain't started out as a magazine. You can see on the left the Overland Monthly, and it has the first printing in any form of Innocents Abroad, a little section from Innocents Abroad. But the magazine didn't sell that well. That's the very first issue of the Overland Monthly. And there was a fellow named Thomas Kane in New York City who decided to repackage it as Overland Sketches by Bret Harte, who got top billing, Mark Twain, who got next billing. Twain would have loved that. And Charles W. Stoddard, whose actual name was Charles W. Stoddard. And that's basically the Overland Monthly packaged as a fake book. If you open the wrapper to the Overland Sketches, you would find the Overland Monthly inside. It's a Twain't. Looks like Twain, kind of is Twain, but really isn't. The next one that I've found is a broadside. It's a political satire published in May of 1871. It's written in what's called the funny fellow style of humor, which was the 19th century equivalent to slapstick or vaudeville. And At the time, Twain was living in Buffalo, not Hartford. This was published in Hartford. He was working on Roughing It. His wife had been deathly ill. A friend of theirs had died in their home a short time before. The Clemens did not move to Hartford until October. This was dated in May. And if you read the thing, it becomes really obvious that Twark Main is not Mark Twain. It's somebody making fun of Mark Twain, just using the name. I've discovered by researching other names that in the 19th century, when you took the names and transposed the first letters of the name, that was usually a tip-off that the work in question was not by that person. It was by somebody else writing a parody of that person. Despite that, many, many Twain scholars have insisted that this is Mark Twain's work. It is not. And it finally, in 1957, was denounced in BAL, the Bibliography of American Literature. The next one up got Twain's attention personally. I don't think Twain ever knew about the other one. But this guy wrote a little book, mostly an advertising booklet, in 1873. He copied some Twain works that had been pirated in England. He pirated them from the English piracy of Twain's work, so he's pirating piracies, kind of a double crime. Twain caught him, filed suit, won the suit, didn't get a dime, but the guy had to pay some court costs to the court, and then he was enjoined from republishing it. However, he did republish it. The second edition over here talks about a $10,000 sketch by Mark Twain. Well, that's just hokum. There was no such, he didn't have to pay, I think he had to pay $10 in court costs. He had published among the piracies one sketch that wasn't even by Twain, a true Twain't, a work written by someone else but presented as Twain's work. And the guy republished the thing, including the sketch that was not by Twain, but again presenting it as if it were by Twain. The second edition may be the only known copy. There's some copies of the first edition that shows up from time to time. The third edition shows up far less often, but the second edition I've not found records of other copies. What's interesting is he includes a text in there of the actual court transcript with Twain's own words and testimony when he sued him. You might wonder, what is an agricultural almanac doing on a Twain't list? What the heck could that have to do with Mark Twain? Well, it has a thing in there, a little sketch in there called Life as I Find It, which was the first title given to a little sketch called Poor Little Stephen Girard. And that sketch is actually pretty good. It's about a little boy that hangs out outside a bank hoping to be hired because he heard about a Horatio Alger story, or a kind of a story like Horatio Alger, where a little bank boy was picking up pens and the bank admired this kid's frugality and hired him to work for the bank, and he married the banker's daughter and became a multimillionaire. So this little kid got the idea, well, if I go out and stand in front of a bank and pick up pens, they'll spot me, hire me, I'll marry the daughter, I'll become rich. Didn't work out that way. The banker came out and said, stop stealing our pens, those belong to the bank, get out of here, and kicked him off the sidewalk, and that was the end of Poor Little Stephen Girard. That story first appeared in the Agricultural Almanac. It was still being reprinted in 1978 by Mark Twain. Mark Twain didn't write it. A guy in New York wrote it. Barb Schmidt, on her wonderful, wonderful Mark Twain website, removed, as it says, Poor Little Stephen Girard from the Mark Twain canon. I think she kind of shot Poor Little Stephen Girard right out of the Mark Twain canon. He's gone. He is no longer attributed to Mark Twain, but he's a Twain't. This particular book you might be wondering about. In 1877, a guy named Arthur Sidgwick published a Greek textbook, and he included a Greek version of the Jumping Frog story. Now, he published it in English, and it was called The Athenian and the Frog. This led to the rumor that the Jumping Frog story did not originate with Mark Twain, but was a Greek story, ancient Greek tale, that Mark Twain had copied. Mark Twain heard the rumor and believed it. In 1894, wrote about it, thinking that he had somehow copied, and Mark Twain was a very well-read man. He was familiar with the Greek and Roman classics, so he may have actually thought, maybe I read the Jumping Frog story in some Greek text and, gave me the idea, but certainly it couldn't be, but by gosh, what a coincidence that the Greeks had a very similar story. Well, it turns out that Twain met Sidgwick in 1899 and learned that no, Sidgwick had written this as an exercise for students in London as a story in English that they could then translate into Greek as an exercise. I took Greek and Latin in college. I wish my professor had given us something like that to translate. It would have made it so much more fun, but she didn't. And I nearly failed the course, and I blame her for not including something like that. But that's a Twain't. It appears to be Twain't. Twain himself thought could be something to it, but it wasn't. Mr. Gimm's Dream. Twain appears as a character in this novel, gives a speech. It's a long story, but I'll make it short. This guy came up with the idea of building a gigantic boat, 1,800 feet long with thousands of people on board, and Twain would be a featured guest and give a speech. He thought this would be a utopian society, and this great big boat to float around the ocean with all these people. And Twain gave a speech. He's just a character. The boat, however, as outrageous as it might have seemed in 1878, isn't so outrageous when you consider that we now have cruise ships that carry many, many more people. He has said about 3,000 people on this ship. Cruise ships nowadays carry 5,000 and 6,000 people. So this guy in 1878 was sort of in a way anticipating the modern day cruise ship. There was a little booklet called the Ben Franklin Primer, and it was full of fake puffs at the back. It was a little collection of sketches for kids, and it had all of these endorsements, including one by Twain, which you'll see, which is right there in the middle, about 4 up from the bottom. Well, not too original to come up with kind of a badly worded puff from Twain, but also from other people. You'll notice one of them is by Brigham Young. He said, "All his children cry for it." Well, if you look at the next item, this gives you an idea of where the guy may have gotten the idea. This is Twain's map of Paris, which was a joke map that he drew for the Buffalo Express in 1871, a few years earlier, and it appeared in the Buffalo Express. It also appeared as a separate printing. This is a completely unrecorded English printing that you can see at the bottom, the imprint, printed as a broadside in England. But you'll notice over here, it has a bunch of fake puffs. These are fake puffs that Twain wrote as a joke. And if you look at the one for Brigham Young, it says, "I cannot look upon it without shedding tears." So you go back to the other one, "My children cry for it." Isn't it interesting that Brigham Young in this one has to do with crying, makes a reference to crying, and this one that Twain wrote himself a few years earlier is Brigham Young. He can't look upon this Twain's map without shedding tears. So the guy that wrote the later one in 1878, I would postulate, very likely got the idea of doing that, perhaps from this particular broadside, which was published in magazines and widely reprinted in newspapers around the country. Twain has nobody to blame but himself for that particular Twain. Cigars. Instead of trying to arrange them neatly, I just photographed the way I have them stacked on the shelf in my library. 15 different Mark Twain cigar tins and boxes of all various kinds. This big one, right here, earliest one known, 1877. It's a cigar box that was actually patented, trademarked in 1877, and it has a label inside with Twain's portrait on it. Some of these have images from Twain's works, illustrations from Twain's works, quotes from Twain's works, printed in their advertising, on their labels, in various forms. Twain was always associated with cigars and with whiskey. Here's a more familiar Twain cigar box. There's a counter card picturing it. That brass plate you see was used to print the embossed label that went on the cigar box, and over here on the right you see a pug advertisement. Pugs were very popular in the 1870s and 80s to advertise and sell all kinds of products. They were selling Mark Twain smoking tobacco. And the little label that you see at the top in the frame, that's the original frame. Now I like to frame a lot of the material in my collection. I sleeve it archivally in Mylar or polypropylene, and then I put it in an antique frame and that protects it from the acidic items in the frame. But I didn't do that in this case. That's the original frame that came with that label, and it has a mat on it that's gilded at the top that says smoke, then it says Mark Twain, and you can't see it because of the glare. I'm not a professional photographer, but at the bottom, if it weren't for the light bulb reflected on that, you would see cigars. So it was an advertising. You use the inner label from the cigar box to advertise Mark Twain cigars. Very rare to find one intact in the original frame, but a pretty unusual item. But again, these things have quotes from Twain, quotes from his works. One of them even has a list of the books that Twain wrote, so it was like free advertising for Twain, but all associated with smoking and cigars. These are books that derive from The Innocents Abroad and The Tramp Abroad, the first two travel books that Twain wrote, actually the first and the third. He also wrote Roughing It, which is travel to the West and to Hawaii. But you'll notice that the books all involve tramps abroad, lady tramps abroad, college tramps abroad, or the Innocents in New York, which were some travelers from Europe who came to America, ran into all kind of problems in New York City. Very modernistic binding on this one on the far end that dates from about 1881. They were all based, like I say, most of them are kind of pastiches, I guess is the best way I could describe them. They're written in Twain style, and some of them actually make direct references to Twain, his works, and Twain himself. This is an excellent example. This is a humidor from the 1880s, and it's an excellent example of the use of Twain's aphorisms to advertise different products. And in this case, it has a Twain quote. It says, "I cultivate my flowers and burn my weed." Mark Twain, embossed right there. So it must be my Mark Twain, right? No. Mark Twain never said that. The guy who said that was a preacher in England named Charles Spurgeon. Twain actually did hear Charles Spurgeon preach one time when he was in England. Charles Spurgeon is also the author of a quote that a lot of you may still think is by Twain. "A lie can go halfway around the world before truth puts on its shoes, or puts on its pants, or truth gets dressed," or it comes in various forms, but that's the general quote. That is not by Twain. That is by Charles Spurgeon. But aphorisms weren't the only thing. Again, Innocents Abroad was victimized. This is probably the first American board game in the modern sense of a board game, issued by Parker Brothers. You think of Parker Brothers being a venerable old firm. Well, not at the beginning. In 1888, when they patented this, and by 1890 or 91, when they actually began producing it, they called it the Innocents Abroad. They were taking advantage of the sound-alike title for Twain's first best-selling book. And copying The Innocents Abroad made a lot of sense because it was a best-selling book. It was probably the best-selling of Twain's books during his lifetime, second only to Tom Sawyer. It's a really good board game. It has a spinner. You play with 4 people. You each get 2 moving pieces. And none of the places you go and none of the things you do have anything to do with anything that happened in The Innocents Abroad. Then everyone started getting into the act. In 1900, there was a history of the San Francisco Fire Department. Twain spent time in San Francisco. He met lots of people in San Francisco. There's Tom Sawyer, a fireman. His name actually was Tom Sawyer. He's not lying about the name. There were hundreds of people named Tom Sawyer living in the United States before the novel Tom Sawyer was written. Any one of them could have falsely claimed to be the model for Tom Sawyer. This guy did. He was interviewed by a guy in a newspaper reporter in the 1890s who made it very clear that Tom Sawyer was the best customer at his own bar. He was not only a firefighter, he was a bar owner. And he sat at his bar drinking, getting drunk, and offering drinks to everybody else around him, including the newspaper reporter during the interview, and he steadily got drunker and drunker as the interview proceeded. And the newspaper writer made it pretty clear, he dropped a lot of hints that this guy was full of malarkey. He claimed to also be the model for Huck Finn, said he and Twain were best friends, that Twain was sending him copies of all of his books. Who would believe that nonsense? Robert Graysmith would believe that nonsense. This poor guy, I am not picking on Robert Graysmith. I don't know the man. He's probably a nice guy. But in 2012, he published a book called Black Fire based upon Tom Sawyer and accepting the the claim that Tom Sawyer was the model for Tom Sawyer in the novel. It's a good story. It's actually a pretty good read. That got debunked on the Mark Twain forum by published a book, including a fellow named Waymarsh, whose name originally was Waymark. And it's believed by James scholars, I don't know about Twain scholars, but James scholars believe that character was based on Mark Twain. And there's reason to believe that because James had met Twain at a dinner where Twain was talking about a Swedish cure, a doctor in Sweden. And James got him confused with a British politician and thought that Twain was talking about the British fellow and got very confused and thought Twain is an idiot. And so he included this character in the novel. James was such a fastidious writer, such a careful writer. In the American edition, in the British edition, I say, the one on the right, every chapter is in the correct order. In the American edition, the blue book on the left, 2 chapters got reversed in order. James' plotting and novels and character development are so superb that that error was not discovered until more than 50 years later. The literary guillotine. A bunch of people are put on trial. Their names are in white at the top. And the judges who sat in judgment of them, including Mark Twain, at the bottom. And the book was advertised in such a way that it would lead you to believe that Mark Twain may have contributed to it. He did not. The trials included Henry James suing Mary Baker Eddy for copying his style, and included a lot of other outrageous literary trials that a lot of contemporary readers would have seen a lot of humor in, that a lot of us would just kind of shake our heads and knit our brows, not understand. But Twain had nothing at all to do with that book. This is going to be a test of your knowledge of Mark Twain aphorisms. These are 1910 trade cards used to advertise cigarettes made by the Mogul Tobacco Company. And each one has a supposed Twain quote on it. Can any of you spot the genuine Mark Twain quote? I'll give you a second to read through them, see if you find any. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Which one do you think is the genuine quote? Come on, somebody. Is only a woman but a good cigars to smoke? No, that one's fake. Anybody else? But good, it's not a bad quote. It's just not Twain. Okay, well, I lied to you. There's not a genuine quote up there. Every one of them is fake. So you couldn't have gotten it right. I just praise you for being brave and stepping forward and hazarding a guess. They're all fake, and that was a common problem. And this is where a lot of the fake quotes that you see on the internet today get their origin. They start out in a magazine, they start out in an advertisement. Golf is, well, we can go on and on. There's a long list of quotes out there that people still think are by Twain, and they're not. And they've been in circulation for generations, literally since Twain's lifetime, like the Spurgeon quote or like these quotes. So now that I've shot my credibility with you, let's try it a different way. Can you spot the fake Twain quote among these? And I think I gave one away already. Golf is a good walk spoiled. Twain never did say that. That one's a fake, but there's a different one that's a fake. So which one would that be? That's a which one is that? Yeah, that's a fake quote. Anyone else want to spot any others I think are fake? Because you can't go wrong. They're all fake. So I lied to you again. I've completely discredited myself, misled you the first time. There were no genuine ones, and this time they're all, yeah. So none of those are by Twain, but you can find them all on the internet. You can buy posters, you can buy bath towels, you can buy wooden plaques, you can buy glasses, you can buy all kinds of nonsense and junk with fake quotes. Not all Twain'ts are funny or entertaining. Some of them are just sad. This one is tragic. The fellow there, Harold Loeb, was a Jewish, and I mentioned specifically that he was Jewish, collector of bookplates in Philadelphia. And in 1912, he hired Hubert Wilm, a German graphic designer, to design what I believe is the first bookplate based upon anything by Mark Twain. It uses, by the way, a genuine aphorism. I'm not lying to you this time. It is a genuine aphorism. It says, consider the proportion of things. It is better to be a young June bug than an old bird of paradise. And then he draws this beautiful bird of paradise that doesn't look that old or decrepit to me. But if you look closely at the June bug at the bottom, I know my June bugs. I grew up in Houston, Texas, where June bugs were everywhere you turned. That is not a June bug. It looks like a short centipede or a long cockroach. I'm not sure. It has too many legs for a cockroach, but it's not long enough to be a centipede. Poor Hubert Wilm, the German bookplate designer, just didn't know what a June bug looked like. I guess Harold Loeb didn't either. He commissioned the bookplate. He loved it. But here's the tragic history. Hubert Wilm was a graphic designer in 1912. He designed a beautiful bookplate. He became a journalist in the 1920s. He became a Nazi in the 1930s. He formed a large collection of art looted from churches and monasteries, synagogues, and other places all over Europe. His art collection was auctioned in the 1950s in 2 auctions, and I've not been able to determine if any of the works that he collected, that he stole from all of these religious, he collected mostly religious art. I don't know if any of his art has been repatriated to the original owners. But Hubert Wilm went from a talented book designer to the worst kind of human being that the world has ever produced. One of the tragedies in the Twain'ts. Out of 550, that's the one that is probably the most disgusting, disappointing, and yet we have a beautiful bookplate early in his career. Here's a Twain't that people believe for years and years. 1916, The Mysterious Stranger. Any Twain scholar knows that this is not by Mark Twain. Mark Twain made a bunch of general notes for it. There were films produced of it in 1920 and 1925. In 1944, the Armed Services Edition was produced in pocketbook form and distributed to troops during World War II all over Europe and the Pacific theater. Fred Danica and Albert Bigelow Paine got together and pasted together a bunch of Mark Twain's notes, even introduced some characters. I think, was it the Merlin character they introduced, or not, or maybe not Merlin. They introduced even a character into the novel that Twain did not include. In 1963, John Tuckey exposed it and wrote a little study of The Mysterious Stranger, delineating exactly what Twain wrote and what he didn't write, and gave the complete history of it. But for years and years, Harper Brothers published and reprinted that book. Twain came back from the dead to write some books. In 1915, he helped Ida Bell White write her book. 2 years later, he helped Emily Hutchings write her book, Jap Heron. The book on the left was never suppressed. The book on the right was. The Mark Twain company went after them and got Mitchell Kennedy, the publisher of that book, to suppress it. It's kind of surprising. Emily Hutchings, her name does not appear on the book. She is the author. She once wrote Twain in 1902 asking for his advice on writing, and Twain dictated a letter back. This is 1 month after Isabel Lyne went to work for Twain in 1902, and she took the dictation and wrote the letter. You can see in a couple of the lines where there are cross-outs and little tiny writing above, Twain went through himself and hand-corrected the letter and revise the text. And he basically is telling her it doesn't matter if you're male or female as a writer, that you stand an equal chance of success, that the real test of writing is that you edit your own work, that you write it and then let it sit, let it simmer, let it percolate, and then come back to it and edit it. Don't just send it right off to a magazine or right off to a publisher. Be your own editor, be your own worst critic. And he gave her that very good advice. And then he mentioned some authors as examples of male and female. He mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mary Baker Eddy, William Dean Howells, Bret Harte, Jesus, and Muhammad. I don't know how they got on the list, but there they are. So what thanks did he get? Well, he came back from the dead, she says, and helped her write a book. She obviously did not take his advice. In the 1920s, a fellow named Edgar Lee Masters, who you may have heard of, wrote a pair of books based upon two little boys, one named Mitch Miller and the other Skeeter's Kirby, who traveled to Hannibal in the mistaken belief that Tom Sawyer was a real boy, and they want to go there and meet him. And they get to Hannibal and they find out he's not real. Along the way, in the first book, poor little Mitch Miller tries to jump onto a train, slips and falls, and he gets sliced to pieces under the wheels of the train. Kind of a brutal way to get rid of a character, but it got rid of him for sure. And then Skeeter's Kirby came back later. That's 1920 on the left, and the first edition on the other side is Skeeter's Kirby. In 1923, that's the sequel. And that's Skeeter's Kirby growing up, starting his career. So Mitch Miller is sort of the boy's book. It's the little boy who never grows up, who's always a boy. And Skeeter's Kirby is the coming-of-age novel, which is sort of the same as Tom Sawyer, which was the boy's book, and Huck Finn, which was the coming-of-age novel for Huck. Tom is a boy at the beginning and end of that story. Huck begins as a boy but ends up on the verge of manhood, having recognized Jim's humanity. And so this book kind of echoes that same thought, that Mitch Miller is the boy who never grows up because he fell under a train, and Skeeter's Kirby is the boy who outgrows the illusion that Tom Sawyer was a real person. And Edgar Lee Masters admired Twain so much that he later wrote a biography of him in 1938. You all have heard of Aunt Polly? This 1923 novel, Aunt Polly's Story of Mankind. This Aunt Polly, in case you're wondering, well, could that really be the same Aunt Polly? Well, this particular Aunt Polly decided she was going to civilize her dead sister's children by educating them. Well, that's exactly what Aunt Polly was doing for Tom Sawyer. She was taking care of Tom Sawyer, who was her dead sister's kid. And this Aunt Polly decided to civilize, to use Huck Finn's word, why he lit out for the territory, in fact, going to civilize her dead sister's children, including a little boy named Sam. So she was going to teach him history. The fellow who wrote this, Donald Ogden Stewart, was a member of the Algonquin Round Table. He was a pretty distinguished fellow, not as well known as Dorothy Parker and some of the other people on the Round Table. He later became a screenwriter. He wrote Philadelphia Story, so he was a very successful screenwriter. He was used by Hemingway as a character in The Sun Also Rises. And what thanks did he get for that? He got blacklisted by the folks in the 1950s when the McCarthyism was running high. The other way Twain's work is they get used in advertising. Titles, Twain himself, the title of his works, get used to advertise all kinds of products. This is Drink Huckleberry Finn in Bottles. That particular brand of cola was branded in 1924. I found a bottle cap for it, but I've never found a bottle. Desperate to find a bottle. I've consulted cola bottle or soda bottle experts. None of them have ever heard of it or seen it, so we don't even know what it looks like. The bottle caps survive, and this rare beanie survives, probably the only one known. In 1931, Dr. Pepper issued a Huckleberry Finn soda, little cap with Huck on the top. But they didn't put a special bottle on it. They just put the cap on their Dr. Pepper bottles, and those were sold and given away at movie theaters if you bought a ticket to go see the 1931 film version of Huckleberry Finn. There's also Tom Sawyer root beer, and there's all kind of wines and beers and whiskeys and champagnes with various Twain connections. All of them are Twain'ts, but they're beverages, you can drink them. Another Twain game, Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. You throw these weird dice that have symbols instead of dots. You have 4 players, you move around a board. Some of the events took place in Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn, some did not. That came out in 1925. The same year, in 1925, the first comic book based on Twain's works appeared, the one on the left, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, by a guy named Dwig, who had written a comic strip for newspapers. In 1942, Tom Sawyer came out in the first, and this is hard to really classify, looks like a modern comic book format. It actually, interior, inside, looks more like a graphic novel. It's kind of a cross between the two, but 1942 is pretty early for a graphic novel. But it looks a lot like a graphic novel on the inside, but it's exactly the size and format of a comic book. And comic books started in the 1930s in this modern format. That's the earliest Twain-related comic book or graphic novel that I have found. We count the other as a comic book, although a lot of kids use it as a coloring book. The first comic book in the modern sense was in 1944, Huck Finn. On the left, there was a Canadian edition, 2 versions of the American edition, and some years later, a Greek edition was issued. And those are the first ones that look like a modern version. It tells some of the stories. It does include Jim. You'd be amazed how often Jim gets dropped out of modern versions of Huckleberry Finn and reprints. He just gets eliminated. People will issue a whole series of Mark Twain dolls with all of the characters. They'll have Aunt Polly, they'll have Judge Thatcher, they'll have Tom, they'll have Huck, but they don't have Jim. And then we get to the little blue books. Those books put Twain in the hands of people all over the Midwest. They cost 10 cents. All of the works are genuine. All of those are those are the first printings of each one of those titles in the Little Blue Book series. They even featured Twain in a magazine. So why do I have them as Twain'ts? They're just reprints of Twain's works. Well, I included them because the publisher, Haldeman Julius, gave an interview where he said he walked around with Twain when Twain was living in New York, and he discusses at length all of the things that Twain said. Totally fake. He never met Twain. They did not walk around. The place is wrong. He cobbled it together from published sources. He put this whole fake interview together and published it in his own journal, pretending that he had actually met Twain. I didn't think to take a photograph of that particular journal. I took the photograph of all the things he published. So Haldeman Julius did a good deed by publishing Twain in a very cheap format that made it available to people all over the place. But he did a very bad thing when he polluted the historical record by falsely claiming that he had met Twain, interviewed him, and elicited all of these answers. The man never did. He was a dishonest fellow. He later went to prison for stock fraud and tax evasion. He was not the only faker out there. In 1926, Mr. Moody says, that's the guy on the left, he was out west and he met Twain and Olivia in Wyoming in 1865, where they were running a hotel and selling real estate. Okay, I think probably most of you know that Twain and Livy did not marry until 1870. That's one problem. Neither one of them ever left and went out to Wyoming, ever. Twain passed through Wyoming on his way to Nevada in a stagecoach very quickly. Never lived there. They never managed a hotel anywhere. They never went into the real estate business. They sold some of the homes they lived in, but they were not real estate agents. So there's some problems with that account. The guy on the right was a Barnum and Bailey clown. He's also a liar. He said that he met Twain at various places at various times. He did not. I have fact-checked him. There's not a fact in the book. He just made it all up. And what the heck is that? Do you know where that came from? Yeah, we click something. I don't know where that. clicker is not working now. So do you want me to operate it off?
Just click this.
Go forward. Which, here and here? Okay. So we'll move forward, and I'll be careful with this keyboard. This brings us to Louisa May Alcott. Louisa May Alcott is said to have made the statement about Huckleberry Finn: if Mr. Clemens cannot think of something better to tell our pure-minded lads and lasses, he had better stop writing for them. She never said that. Thomas Beer said it. Thomas Beer said it in this book, The Mauve Decade, which was a very popular book. The trade edition's on the left, a limited edition on the right, and copy A of 15 copies is the one at the bottom, autographed by Thomas Beer. Thomas Beer made up a bunch of stuff in that book. He made up all the Conrad letters. He made up the Alcott quote. I have checked printed sources, correspondence, a couple of Alcott experts. The person, the letter, and the sources that have been given, I've read all the issues of the Critic where it was supposedly printed. It's not there. The woman that he supposedly wrote the letter to didn't exist. So there's a problem. I would say, until further evidence comes forward and proves otherwise, that Louisa May Alcott never denounced the book. But Thomas Beer, who is a proven liar and lied extensively in this particular book, he is the earliest known printed source for that quote. And I contend that Miss Alcott is innocent of denouncing Huck Finn, and that it's all on Thomas Beer. So that arrow's not moving it. Do you know what's... So how'd you get that to work again?
Just clicking in here. I think
you're
it probably had something else.
Okay. We'll see. Green Hills of Africa. The Green Hills of Africa by Ernest Hemingway contains a quote that's been widely quoted. All American literature comes, let me read it the way Hemingway would have, although he had a high-pitched voice with a very nasal tone. But Hemingway, I'll pronounce it, I'll pontificate the way he intends it here. All modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. If you read it, you must stop where the nigger gem is stolen from the boys. That is the real end. The rest is just cheating, but it's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before. There has been nothing as good since. Well, that's all well and good, but a few pages before, we find out that he's been drinking. And that's on page 19. That's page 22. So he drinks for the next 3 pages. I wouldn't say he gets 3 sheets to the wind, but he's been drinking by the time he says that. So he says it, and then when he gets through saying it, a few pages later on page 29, he admits, I did have verbal dysentery. So that Hemingway quote that gets quoted so often by so many was spoken by a drunk who admitted a short time later that he engaged in verbal dysentery. Hemingway himself actually didn't say it. It's a character based on Hemingway, and it's a character who'd been drinking and then admits to dysentery. Therefore, a Twain't. This is certainly a Twain't. The Disneyfication of Twain's works has been ongoing for years. It starts right here in 1933 with Connecticut Yankee, a pop-up book, one of the very earliest Walt Disney pop-up books. I have the book open to one of the 4 pop-ups in the dust jacket in the background. It's a wonderful book, except that the plot doesn't quite follow the original, and there are no mice in the original Connecticut Yankee, and none of them attended any jousting matches. Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass in 1856 was a pseudonym used by Twain. But Quintus Curtius Snodgrass in 1861 was not. And it was disproven by a friend of mine named Claude Benninger, who was a pretty old fellow when I first met him. He used a computer analysis, word frequency analysis, I guess. There's a linguistic term for that I don't remember off the top of my head. And on that basis, he pronounced this as a falsely attributed work. But it did get published in 1946, and a lot of people believed it. And some of it is actually pretty good writing, and it does have a kind of a Twainian flavor, and it is connected to the Mississippi. I wouldn't be surprised if the guy was inspired by Twain or there wasn't some connection. But Twain himself did not write the letters, it would seem. So it qualifies as a Twain't. Here's a Hartford Twain't. Some of you may know about Peter Clancy. He was a detective. He's the creation of Lee Thayer, which was the pen name for Emma Reddington Lee, who wrote a series of 50 or 60 detective novels featuring Peter Clancy. He lives in the billiard room in the Mark Twain house at the time that it was a public library. This was written in 1947, published in 1947. It includes a murder, detective work to determine the origins of a Mark Twain forgery, which was the cause of the murder, if I'm recalling correctly. I read this a long time ago. My wife is a big fan of detective fiction. She read it, and I asked her if it was any good, and she went, yeah. But that's pretty high praise for my wife. She asked me if I'm any good, and she goes, yeah. It's also possibly the first novel written using the forgeries of T.J. Wise. And if you don't know about Thomas J. Wise, he was a notorious forger in the late 19th century who forged all kinds of literary printed items and was exposed in the 1930s. So Lee Thayer, or Emma Lee, came along and wrote this novel and mentions Thomas J. Wise by name and kind of borrows the idea of literary forgeries from Thomas J. Wise's career. What Mad Universe? This was based on quantum theory. It's science fiction. Things happen and then they don't happen. Everything is true at once. Sam Clemens exists, but he doesn't. Mark Twain exists, but he doesn't. Tom and Huck are real, but they're not. It's a real quantum theory thriller kind of a thing, and it has a scantily clad woman, because if you want to sell science fiction to young readers, you gotta have scantily clad women. This is 1949. That is pretty racy, pretty sexy. Uh-oh, 1953. We now have two Twain works, Connecticut Yankee, and of course, The Unnatural Son. Some of you are probably going, The Unnatural Son? What's that? Well, it's Pudd'nhead Wilson, of course, but under a new title, which makes it a Twain't. I don't remember any sexy women in The Unnatural Son, or Pudd'nhead Wilson, or the Connecticut Yankee, and if there were any, maybe Roxy, but they didn't dress that way, and Roxy was not white. So, kind of a problem, kind of a bodice ripper, paperback. It gets worse. Here's another one of those books based on The Innocents Abroad. The Not So Innocents Abroad. I'll repeat that for anybody who didn't get the pun the first time. Not So Innocent Abroad. This stuff is awful. If that was a bodice ripper, close your eyes, because it's going to get worse. We're going to go totally nude now. Yes, buck naked. This guy, Ed Trossel, who was a New Hampshire barber, who ended up in Florida selling real estate, not Wyoming like Mark Twain and Libby. He was a judge at the Miss Nude World pageant. So you know where this film is going. And he becomes possessed by the spirit of Mark Twain. Great movie, never got released, never got off the ground. The posters got issued, they're kind of scarce, but they're out there. And there's actually a short clip on YouTube of an excerpt from this particular film. This guy didn't die until just 3 or 4 years ago. I wish I'd known he was still alive. I would have called him up. I had a lot of questions for him. But there he is, thinking pretty highly of himself, I think. Now let's talk about clothing. Mark Twain furs. Certainly a Twain't. You're branding a bunch of furs. That's a mink stole. There were also sable, pelts, all kind of furs sold under the Mark Twain label. Clara Clemens, Mark Twain's daughter, licensed her father's name to a Detroit furrier who made these furs. If you think furs are strange in connection with Mark Twain, there's Mark Twain wearing his famous sealskin coat inside out, along with a ushanka, which is the Russian hat, which also has the fur out, which is supposed to. But the sealskin coat is not supposed to. Twain showed up at Thomas Bailey Aldrich's after they'd been out drinking, and Lillian Aldrich, who Twain despised, would not let them come in the house and would not serve him dinner. So Twain left. She later wrote an abject apology and realized she'd made a mistake. Because he had such a strong drawl, she thought that he was, because he talked like this and he had that drawl, so she thought he was drunk, but he wasn't. He was just Twain. Howell said that whenever they went walking together, that attracted a lot of attention on the street. Furs are not the only product. Shirts. The Mark Twain Shirt Company does uniform shirts, pants, shoes. They do rockabilly shirts, Hawaiian shirts, school uniforms, and in this case, the Calypso shirt, which is a shirt that I wore on a virtual presentation one time. Notice the little button at the bottom. You can barely see it, in the shape of a sombrero. They made some cool shirts. Unfortunately, there are, believe it or not, shirt collectors out there who collect exotic, weird shirts. And some of these Mark Twain shirts, especially the rockabilly and Hawaiian shirts, can fetch hundreds of dollars. I paid $20 for mine, but holy mackerel. But they're Twain's. This was a hoax, but people believed it. It fooled some people. I'm not going to say, I'm not going to name the scholars that were fooled by this, but, well, I will name one of them. William Targ, an eminent book critic and reviewer and publisher, was taken in by it. This book claimed the remarkable echo that Twain and Edgar Allan Poe and Lewis Carroll and Nathaniel Hawthorne were all the same person. It was absurd. He even engaged in a bunch of writing with the American book collector after this was published in the 1933, I think. It was written by a brother and sister team who were still living at home in their 30s. Kind of strange. Not that one person would be living, but both the brother and the sister were living at home in their 30s, writing a very elaborate hoax. And the thing is full of little hints that it's a hoax, like a deck of cards with the Joker showing. Just bizarre stuff. Now you read this and you would think, well, this has to be a hoax too. This woman claimed that the spirit of Mark Twain came to her in 1968 and via a Ouija board, which was called a Nona board by her husband who invented this kind of Ouija board or planchette, and that they talked to their dead daughter. And that's where it gets sad. Their daughter had recently died. Their businesses had failed. They had other financial reversals. Other members of their family were sick, dead, or dying. They were spiritualists. They sincerely believed in seances and everything that they talk about. She said that Twain came down from the astral plane and connected her with her daughter. And it's a really sad book to read. If you think of any parent that's lost a child or a grandchild, you'd realize that the woman was in terrible pain, utterly sincere, nothing funny about it, really just a sad, sad Twain. So not all Twain'ts are Nazis and evil, not all Twain'ts are ridiculous, not all Twain'ts are funny. Sometimes they're just tragic, just sad. But before you think the woman was ridiculous for going to seances and trying to talk to her dead daughter, let's remember that Sam and Olivia also went to seances and tried to talk to Susie. This little book, back to the ridiculous Twain'ts, U.S. Smith up a tree with Mark Twain. He claimed to be the grandson of the illegitimate daughter of Mark Twain. That bundle of correspondence in the back is correspondence between eminent Twain scholars Lou Budd, Tom Tenney, Walter Blair, and Ham Hill, who are trying to figure out, I got this I think from Tom Tenney, who are trying to figure out whether this was a hoax or not. And between the four of them, their best guess was, I don't know. They couldn't figure it out. They don't know if this guy was absolutely nuts or if he was trying to tell the truth. But it was a Twain't. This is one of the very first editions of Huckleberry Finn to have the N-word removed and replaced. But this particular fellow, John Wallace, and the book is actually kind of scarce, he, in 1983, He caught heck for doing this, deservedly so. This is not like the Alan Gribben book that substitutes the word solely for the purpose of getting it into classrooms where it otherwise would have been rejected. This guy was trying to correct what he thought was racism. He was a black man. He was offended by the word. But he also made other changes in the book that completely undercut the themes of the book, completely just took the claws out of the book. He didn't realize the satire and the irony of the book. He didn't realize that white racists were in the crosshairs of Mark Twain. Every time they said that word, they identified themselves as being what they were. So he removed all of that, and in the process, completely denuded the book of its power. Really a sad, sad case. Well-intended, but a bad result. Mark Twain coffee mugs. I've got a bunch of them, 80 of them at last count. There probably are more, I don't care. They come from the 1960s right up until last year. They are full of fake quotes of Mark Twain. They're just as bad as any that you might imagine. John Seeley wrote a book in 1970. He revised it in 1987. It's written from the perspective of Huck Finn, a rewriting of the true adventures of Huck Finn, but what he does is very cleverly refute and answer all of the charges against the book leveled by various critics over the years, but he has Huck Finn do it. And then he did an updated version 7 years later, taking on still some more critics. He takes on Devoto, Brooks, Trilling, and T.S. Eliot. Goes after everybody, and then he updated it after 7 years, taking aim at even more. This is the Riverworld series, a science fiction series by Philippe José Farmer, a very famous science fiction novel. A science fiction collector looking at that shelf of books would be drooling at the first volume because it's in a dust jacket in perfect shape and a correct first printing. But it doesn't have any Twain. But volumes 2, 3, 4, and 5 do. Twain shows up as a character, as a steamboat captain or pilot, or maybe in this novel as a captain, I think. But anyway, it's the longest Twain't that I've found. It's a 5-volume Twain't, 4 volumes with Twain featured in it. So it's a rather extended Twain't. They were published between 1971 and 1983. This is probably the earliest graphic depiction of Twain, like a graphic novel, except it's a graphic biography in 1977. The credit for the first graphic novel is generally agreed to be 1978. We tend to think of them as being a phenomenon of the 1990s and later, but they were around earlier, just not as popular. But this is a biography aimed at children. It was sold exclusively to libraries, and the only way you can get copies is to get an ex-library copy, unfortunately. So if you're a book collector, it really chafes your hide that you can't get a pristine copy. What's surprising about it is it's accurate. The drawings, the depictions, everything in it is surprisingly accurate. The depiction of the home here, the dinner, there aren't any anachronisms. There's nothing really wrong except the covers of the books here in the bottom if you really want to get picky. But I've seen worse. But not bad, but aimed at children. The Grateful Dead. If you don't recognize them, that's Huck and Tom. The shirt on the left is the genuine shirt issued. Very desirable if you're a Grateful Dead fan. The one on the right is a reissue, much later. First issued in 1995, sold by groupies who followed the band around, selling them bootleg. One of the quotes that Huck says in Huckleberry Finn is, "It's lovely to live on a raft." First thing I thought when I saw that was, well, if that's living, I don't want to try that. But certainly a Twain, certainly a use of Twain's themes, writings, characters in a new way. In 1995 to 2001, Peter Heck wrote a series of 6 books, all takeoffs on Mark Twain's works. They actually do have some themes and characters. I think the titles are wonderful. I hope do I need to read them or can you see them? Yeah, I think they're pretty good. The first 3 in his series were issued in hardback. The last 3 were issued only in paperback, so I don't know why. And he hasn't published any of them since. He stopped publishing in 2001. I believe he's still alive. He was up until just a few years ago, but I don't know why he hasn't written any more of them. They're good reading. I recommend them. They're entertaining. This is a terrific book, Twain's Feast. I think you can buy this in the gift shop in a reprint. It's published in 2010. The guy went all over America trying to recreate the foods that Twain mentions in his books, but he tried to find them in their authentic 19th century form, which was not easy. Tim Champlin, somebody known to a lot of us in the Twain community. He passed away earlier this year, but he wrote a series of books, a trilogy of time travel books involving Tom Sawyer and Huck. They're very good. They're very entertaining. They're aimed at young readers, not so much adults, but I enjoyed reading one and reviewed one. He wrote, I think, 7 Twain-themed books. He himself took a trip down the Mississippi solo in a 16-foot sloop back in the 1970s. Quite a remarkable guy. And the very last Twain'ts that we're going to look at are 4 Twain'ts published recently, all of them highly recommended reading. The one on the left, John Clinch's Finn, kind of a counterpoint, a dark counterpoint to Huckleberry Finn, all about Pap Finn. Where was Pap? What was he doing while Huck was with Jim? And he explores that with some really surprising results. Really great reading. The one on the far right, you probably all heard of. Percival Everett James just won the Pulitzer Prize. It's kind of Jim 2.0. It's kind of Jim, 21st century Jim. It's not a counterpoint the way John Clinch's book is. It's really using Huckleberry Finn as a point of departure. They start down the river, they get a little ways, and then takes off in a different direction. If you've ever seen the movie Django in Chains, this is kind of like Jim in Chains, Unchained, I'm sorry. So if you think of Jim Unchained and what he would have done compared to Django Unchained and what he did in the movie, which I thoroughly enjoyed and thought it was hilarious when he was shooting at the women in her parlor, a woman on a plantation. I was laughing. No one in the movie theater was laughing with me, but I thought it was a hoot. She had it coming. But it's a really good book, but it takes Jim in a very different direction and updates him in a way. Gillian Flynn, Gone Girl, terrific movie, but the movie is not the same as the book. A couple, they're married, the wife disappears, the husband falls under suspicion for murder, but it's okay. She shows up, and I won't spoil it any further than that. You got to figure out what happened, what didn't happen. And his background was that he grew up in Hannibal and played Tom Sawyer when he was a little boy. And then you get to Flood by Melissa Scholes Young, superb novel about a woman who grew up in Hannibal, and it raises the question of, can you go home again? She goes home again. She had a lost love. She goes home to see if she could go home again. I won't tell you what she does or what she decides, but it's should she stay or should she go, or should she stay or should she go? I won't tell you what she decides or what she does. It was her first novel. It should have won prizes. I gave it a rave review in the Mark Twain Forum. I don't write very many rave reviews. I'm kind of hard to please, but that novel was terrific. At least as good as James in a different way. And that concludes all of the Twain'ts that I have for you this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I would only repeat what I said earlier, that Twain'ts, no matter what they are, no matter how ridiculous they are, no matter how silly they are, no matter how tragic they are, or sad or disturbing, whatever form they take, you just have to remember they reflect the culture at the time in which they were created. And that has a lot of meaning for us because Twain, unlike most authors, has lived on and on and on. It's just that when you start looking at Twain'ts, he's lived on and on and on in kind of unfamiliar and strange ways. But I think it's fun to look at him from this point of view. So with that, I will leave you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. The fur, yeah. That was in the 1940s. So Alcib Gavrilovich had died in 1938, I think, 36, I think. And she had married, I think in 44 or 45, she had married Jacques Sommesud. And Jacques Sommesud began spending her money gambling, running through her money pretty quick. And she was, trying to raise money. So she sold or leased, licensed the Mark Twain name to the fur company. And they produced furs through the 40s and 50s anyway, for about 10 years that I know of. And I bought a mink on eBay for like 20 bucks, really cheap. I don't think women are buying genuine furs these days like they used to. You don't want to go out and be seen in a fur. I dared my wife to go wear it. She wouldn't. But there you are. But like I said, if you think it's weird, you just have to remember that Twain, he loved to get attention. He'd wear a fur coat inside out just to get people to look at him. Later in life, he'd wear his white suit and traipse up and down Fifth Avenue in front of the churches on a Sunday when the churches were letting out, just so people would see him. Yes? Yeah. Yes. Twain was one of the first celebrities in the modern sense of the word, literary figure and cultural icon. And so his name, his brand, if you will, was valuable. And that's why a lot of these Twain'ts exist, is people wanted to exploit the name Mark Twain or any of his works. Parker Brothers, Innocents Abroad. I mean, you've seen them all. I don't really need to go down the list again. And they all wanted to exploit that name, take advantage of it. And in those days, Twain did trademark the name Mark Twain under the mistaken belief that he could use a trademark the way you'd use copyright, so that anybody that would reprint his works using the name Mark Twain, assigning the name Mark Twain to them, would be stopped. And the judge ruled against him and said, no, a trademark applies to vendable products, not literary productions. So copyright and trademark, in Twain's mind, were confused. He was hoping to be able to use it. Being a first celebrity, he was blazing the trail. Nowadays, if you went out and tried to sell products using any celebrity's name, you'd get a nasty gram from their lawyer within hours, days, pretty quick. They would slam you down, shut you down really quick. Twain tried to do that as much as he could, but I suspect he just didn't know about a lot of them. All of those Mark Twain cigars, the only one I know of that was licensed, two that were licensed, we can tap to those really quick. If you look at the ones on the top shelf, yeah, the only one was that first one in 1877 was actually registered, trademarked Mark Twain. Whether Twain actually allowed that or whether they just did it themselves, I don't know. One of those things I should check with the Mark Twain papers and find out if they have any documents or correspondence on it. This one at the bottom in 1913, I think was actually licensed by the Mark Twain Company at that time. But going back to the other 15 that you see, none of those were. And the Mark Twain tobacco and the Mogul cigarettes and all the rest of it, not at all. And the Mark Twain smoking tobacco, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've got a bunch of other tobacco-related products and advertising and things. Twain just wasn't aware of most of that stuff. Certainly not the use of his, and then you have the thorny issue of using the fake aphorisms, wherever those were, I've lost track of them. But in 1910, they're using fake aphorisms on those little cigarette cards, but attaching his name to them. So there's the Mark Twain trademark attached to something he didn't write. So they're not violating his copyright, but they're certainly misrepresenting, damaging his reputation, if you look at it that way, by assigning fake quotes to him. I think that game was probably licensed in the 1920s. My guess is, I don't know for a fact that it was, but my guess is that it was. But I've got stacks of Mark Twain products and advertising, leaflets, posters, all kinds of things during his lifetime. And only a tiny, tiny fraction of them were authorized. There were Mark Twain shirts issued during his lifetime, Mark Twain shirt collars. The list just goes on. All kind of Mark Twain oysters, an amazing array of products. So yeah, he didn't get to exploit that until rather late. And then when the guy gave him the idea, it was Ralph Ashcroft, who turned out to be a common thief. So when Twain finally got some good business advice to register his name and go after these people, form the Mark Twain Company, it came from a guy who ended up marrying Isabel Lyon and embezzling about $3,000 from the Twain estate. So rather unfortunate turn of events. Other questions? All right, well, I thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.